Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. I'm Jim Clementi, a retired FBI profiler and former New York City prosecutor. And with me I have
Laura Richards, founder and director of Paladin, National Stalking Advocacy Service and criminal behavioural analyst.
And Lisa Zambetti, casting director for Criminal Minds, where I work with Jim Clementi.
Well, it's great to be here talking again about People versus O.J. Simpson, a very controversial case called at times the case of last century, and we have lots to discuss. So what we wanted to do, though, as a kind of a break from what has been covered in the series, is actually get into a little more depth about Nicole Simpson. We will also cover Ron Goldman in a subsequent podcast, but today we're going to focus on that history of the relationship between Nicole and O.J. Simpson and some of the things that went down.
And Laura had a really good point. We were discussing this earlier about how we don't really get to know Nicole in the series. Do you want to talk about that, Laura?
Yeah, and I think it's an important part, in all cases, and certainly, the work that I do both as an advocate, understanding victims and doing risk assessments with them, and also when someone's been murdered. You want to really get an understanding of who they are, how they lived, and bring that person into a 360 sort of portrayal or a 3D portrayal of who they are. So, we know Nicole was a mum, she was a sister, she was a good friend to people, she was a daughter. She played many roles and she was seen as the rock of the family. And her sisters have certainly tried to ensure her legacy lives on. And I think it's an important point that everyone around her said that they had missed the warning signs of what was happening, that Nicole chose not to speak about what was happening, as many victims do, and they try and survive things, they try and manage it as best they can. But I think this context is really important. Of what was going on prior. So they were together for 17 years, on and off. There was a lot of back and forth going on. She got together with him when she was 18 years of age, so she was very young, and he was an older male. I think when he was asked, he couldn't even remember. He was saying that he was 28, 29. So right away you've got a sort of a power imbalance, because we know who he was, and at the top of his career, and she was a waitress at the time and he was married, and so that provides a context. But certainly some might say it was a volatile relationship, it was turbulent, but I would certainly say it was abusive from all that we know. And certainly the 911 calls, which we're going to listen to some of those, I think it's important that we understand who Nicole, and we will understand Ron as well, but who she really was.
Yeah. And when this call and the photos that were taken of her after she was abused by him were just absolutely at the time shocking. I mean, it was shocking to think that he could do this, OJ, this particular celebrity, and it was just shocking to hear and see these photos. So
right, but when you think about who he was, what his profession was, the size of him, the strength of him. I mean, it's certainly, he was physically capable of doing it. It's just that people didn't think that such a nice guy like OJ could be this kind of a monster to the person he supposedly loved.
And this is the Jekyll and Hyde, and I think it's an important, point to consider and understand that here is somebody who is loved by everybody. And Nicole may well have felt, well, who would believe her? Who would believe, when he is so charismatic and charming, and that people think he's so wonderful. So, there are reasons why people stay quiet. When they're being abused, it can also be the shame and the humiliation and the fear. And she had children with him. So I have no doubt that she did feel love for him. But there was a very unhealthy power imbalance going on, and who she was at the time when they met, being 18 and young and malleable, to who she was as a woman when she died. She had a huge amount of growth to do as a human being, and controlling people don't like that sort of change. So when she may be changing in terms of her wants and her needs and her desires, it can upset upset the homeostasis. And here is somebody who does not want to let her go, does not want that separation even after their divorce. There's still a lot of back and forth going on, and she makes a final decision that she's had enough. But in between that, there's a lot of incidents that occur, and I say incidents in my usual inverted commas because domestic abuse is a pattern of behaviour. It is not a one-off isolated incident. And I think when people saw some of the things that were happening, her sisters included, they put it down to isolated incidents. And the first thing we need to make people aware of, that domestic abuse is a whole pattern of behaviour.
Okay, so let's just listen to it and comment after.
Yep.
911 emergency.
Can you get someone over here now to 325 Gretna Green? He's back. Please.
Well, okay, what does he look like?
He's O.J. Simpson. I think you know his record. Could you just send somebody over here?
Okay, what is he doing there?
He just drove up again.
He just drove
somebody
up.
over?
Okay, wait a minute. What kind of car is he in?
He's in a white Bronco. But first of all, he broke the back door down to get in.
Okay, wait a minute. What's your name?
Nicole Simpson.
Okay, is he the sportscaster or whatever?
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Wait a minute. We're sending the police. What is he doing? Is he threatening you?
I'm going nuts.
Okay, has he threatened you in any way, or is he just harassing you?
You're going to hear him in a minute. He's about to come in again.
Okay, just stay on the line.
I don't want to stay on the line. He's going to beat the shit out of me.
Wait a minute. Wait, just stay on the line so we can know what's going on till the police get there, okay? Okay, Nicole?
Uh-huh.
Just a moment. Does he have any weapons?
I don't know.
Okay.
He went home, now he's back. My kids are upstairs sleeping, and I don't want anything to happen.
Okay. Has he hit you today or no?
No.
Okay, you don't need any paramedics or anything? Okay. You just want him to leave?
My door. He broke the whole back door in.
And then he left and he came back?
Then he came and he practically knocked my upstairs door down, but he pounded it, and then he screamed and hollered, and I tried to get him out of the bedroom because the kids were sleeping in there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then he wanted somebody's phone number, and I gave him my phone book and put my phone book down to write down the phone number that he wanted, and then he took my phone book with all my stuff in.
What does he say?
What else?
Units, your domestic violence at 30 Cartier 325 South Gretna Greenway is now too high. The suspect is now entered in the shelter, and it is refusing to leave. It's code too high. Incident 4221 RD 825. Children involved. Just stay on the line, okay? Is he upset with something that you did?
Oh, a long time ago. It always comes back.
Wow. Well, I just have to talk about the last question that was asked. Is he upset with something you did? I mean, isn't that just the typical, like, victim blaming? You did something, and that's why he's upset? I mean, it's just, why is the dispatcher asking that? She can clearly hear him cursing, screaming. I mean, she's been told that this has happened a number of times before. She's also been told that he busted down the back door. He's coming back. He's going to beat the shit out of me. And she asks, well, is he upset because you did something?
Yeah, I mean, it's, if we put it back in its context in time, so this was
October 25th, 1993.
So 1993, and we have a dispatcher who's asking pretty much all the wrong questions in terms of risk and in terms of what's happening, and you can hear Nicole's desperation. I'd certainly say to start with fear.
Her voice,
fear.
oh, God.
So the right questions to ask, and this is something I've trained a lot of law enforcement on, having created the dash risk model. Sometimes you only get that one occasion to ask the right questions, and unfortunately that dispatcher places pretty much all the blame onto Nicole inadvertently. Is it something that you did? As Jim said, is it just, is he threatening you, or is he just harassing you?
Yeah.
As if it's something
What's
that's very low level.
I mean, yeah.
And I think the lack of urgency is something that we don't hear, the lack of urgency from the police, when you can hear OJ swearing and cursing and, completely fearless around the consequences that Nicole's on the phone to the police and of the children.
Yeah,
being
not
there.
saying, can you get to somewhere safe? Can you lock yourself in your room with your kids? Can you get a place where you're going to protect yourself? No, there's none of that concern. It's just like, okay, well, they'll get there. And then, well, he's just harassing you, or he's just,
It's
she
totally
said, I am
minimized.
afraid of him beating the shit out of me. He's going to beat the shit out of me.
And him coming back, has he got weapons? Well, she doesn't know what he's got when he's coming back to the house. And I think, again, when victims reach out for help, they call 911 or they call 999 because they are in immediate fear. They are in danger. And yet so often the response, historically we can say, but also we still have occasions, I've certainly listened to calls where women have actually been killed on the 999 call to the police.
That's the UK's version of 911.
It is. That's why I made the point of saying 911, 999. So, when people do reach out at that level and you do hear fear, they're not calling for a friendly chat. And I think Nicole felt that there wasn't an urgency. And again, why do people stay? Well, they stay because other people around them, when they're reaching out, almost minimise everything that's going on and what's happening to them. And, this is somebody who reached out for help many times, and it was something that wasn't seen as serious. And that's why we always say to victims, trust your instinct, and get to a place of safety, because she was clearly fearful of him, and you could hear that in her voice the whole way through.
Yeah, and he's doing this, and he knows his kids are there. That's the thing. He has absolutely no control.
No
over,
control.
I mean, how
Or perhaps he does have the control, and actually I would argue that he does have the control, in the sense that if we think about what happens, the psychology for a victim, that each time they're victimised and nothing happens, and that perpetrator isn't held to account, then their trust and confidence goes in the system. And we think about the psychology for the perpetrator, what happens every time they do something and nothing happens, it emboldens them to get away with it more and more, and you see escalation. And it's exactly what we saw in this particular case, the escalation. And Nicole isn't reaching out to her family, she's calling the police, but there would be people around her that would know some of the things that are going on, because victims rarely remain totally silent about what's happening when they're experiencing serious abuse at this level. And I'm not just talking about physical, it's the psychological, it's the coercive control, it's the drip, drip, drip of undermining, it's the stalking. And it's the threats, not just for Nicole to herself. Yes, she has been beaten before, but it's the threats to others as well that can keep someone very much in situ.
Right, and she apparently has called the police, 8 or 9 times before she was actually murdered. And, unfortunately, because the person who was doing it was the juice, somebody that a lot of cops look up to and don't believe it could be a bad guy. They basically, they just treated them as isolated incidents and not as a pattern of behavior that was going to end in Nicole's death. Hello, it's Jim Clemente and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
So what are the right questions, Laura?
Well, certainly using the DASH risk assessment model, that's a good place to start. And training call handlers and dispatchers, you only get that one chance when somebody does call for help. So it's asking questions about separation. It's asking questions about escalation. Is it happening more often and is it getting worse? It's asking questions about strangulation. about sexual abuse, there's about coercive control, and all of the questions that are in the Dash risk model have actually been, I've developed the questions with victims because they know best how to put these questions. So the threats to kill, stalking, so that we get a snapshot of exactly what's happening to the victim, and therefore the call handler and those who attend the scene know and understand the type of person that they're dealing with. And unfortunately, with OJ, it was always put down to, it's just an argument. I think on another 911, she's told it's just an argument then that you're having.
Yeah, I didn't. What we played actually isn't the entire call. I was just looking at the rest of the transcript, and then the 911 operator is saying, "Are you arguing with him too?" "No, absolutely not." "Oh, okay, Nicole, that's not arguing." The dispatcher, "Yeah, has this happened before or no?" "Nicole, many times."
So again, it's a train crash of a conversation because the dispatcher is asking all the wrong questions and in the wrong way, where they're inadvertently sort of minimising and blaming the victim. Yeah. So that's why we've created, and I've certainly been one of the people leading the work, asking the right questions at the right time, because the victim can hold a mirror up to who the perpetrator is. And that mirror is important because it tells us about their risk, their threat level to the victim and also to others. So we also know that Nicole had reached out to a refuge hotline 5 days prior to her murder, and she had said very clearly that she was being stalked and he'd threatened her, and she said that he would end up killing her. How prophetic. And I've certainly seen cases. One of the other things that I do back in the UK is review domestic violence homicides. So I've reviewed hundreds of cases where sadly the victim has been prophetic and said that they will be killed, and particularly when they're being stalked, and that domestic violence stalker makes a threat to kill, 1 in 2 of them will act on it. So that 1 in 2, that 50%, we know now through research. So the right questions, Jim, to ask, we know through research what they are, and we would hope that people calling now would get a much better response, and that they're believed, and that they're validated, and that they're empowered. And sometimes you only get a very small window of opportunity to intervene and prevent something much more serious from happening.
Yeah, I think it's important. I mean, this is one of the reasons why law enforcement training is so critical. Unfortunately, in the United States, there's 17,000 different law enforcement agencies. Many of them are 1-, 2-, and 3-man operations, and they don't have money for training. They don't have the ability to go to national seminars and to be constantly updated with professional training. And because of that, they're literally relying on their own wits. And people who haven't been trained in this specific area will, and by the way, this is a very dangerous area for law enforcement as well, because a lot of cops get shot and killed responding to domestic
it's where most police officers
situations.
are injured on duty
Really?
when they're attending domestic violence incidents, which is why it's so important that people understand how dangerous these situations are. It's not just a domestic. It's much more likely where victims, women and children, are going to be killed, as well as law enforcement
because
being
on
injured.
top of whatever the underlying issue is, but the emotion level is so high that it is a volatile situation. And that when she minimizes by saying, so he's just harassing you, that is just, it's an ignorant statement. I mean, harassing, by the way, is a crime, right? So she shouldn't be minimizing that, but also she should be aware that this is an indicator of very dangerous potential violence. And the fact that he took a door down means that he is big physically, he is being violent, he's being aggressive. That should be, she should have said, you need to get somewhere safe to protect yourself right now before he comes upstairs. Don't wait. She didn't say any of that.
And you get a sense that she was a sitting duck. So I'm going to throw it out there right now when people say, well, why doesn't she leave? Well, 75% of the rapes that I reviewed as part of a piece of work to create a risk assessment model, 75% of those women who'd suffered abuse had already left.
Yeah, and she has left. She's in her own house now. They're divorced when this is all happening, when he's trespassing.
So this is where we see an escalation, because if I can't have you, no one will. This sort of psychopathology plays out. And, certainly in terms of some of the incidents, in inverted commas, that we hear about, because they were not isolated, it was a continuum of abuse and violence. We hear about Nicole trying to leave, trying to separate. It is a high risk factor to serious harm and homicide. And we certainly hear one of her sisters testifying about one of those particular occasions where he grabs Nicole and he grabs her actually by the crotch. But we also hear about other incidents where he's grabbed her by the throat. But it talks about his entitlement, his ownership of her. And I think this is really the crux of what's been going on within the relationship, that he saw her as a possession, that he owned her and there was no way that he was going to let her go. And this is where the stalking can happen in a relationship, but also outside of a relationship. And I think it's interesting that Nicole chose to use that word way back then to say that he was stalking her, i.e. the war of attrition was so great, she just couldn't separate from him and leave safely. He would not allow it. And that's why she said, he will end up killing me and I know he'll get away with it. Well, why does she say that? Because time and time again, when she's called the police and she's called for help, he has gotten away with it.
Yeah, so should have happened? I mean, the police, after she makes this call, during the call, they arrive, right? How can they not arrest him?
Well, I think he may have been arrested in this case. I think he pled no contest.
No, that was I don't believe so.
Well, I don't know when this call was made then.
So this was in 1993. The only time he was ever arrested was when they were still married, and that's, I think, in 89, and that's when he actually did the community service.
Because she had physical signs of abuse on her, probably.
No
and
doubt,
that's something that
pictures.
We've talked about before many times, and this is actually something that we talked about in the Steve Avery case with respect to Jody, that police officers will hear a complaint that the guy, the husband, the boyfriend, was violent with the woman and strangled her, and the cops look and she doesn't have any marks on her neck, so he thinks, well, that's a lie, and lets the guy go. Well, the fact is that bruising takes hours and days to come up, and you can't make an assessment just based on that. And if you arrive on the scene and the back door is busted down.
The door is broken.
I mean, that is obviously breaking and entering, and obviously he should have been arrested for this.
Is it whether she presses charges or not?
Well, you can have positive arrest strategies, and in fact, some states in America do operate that, and again, in some places in the UK, we actually turned it into a strategy that you have to give a decision as to why you didn't arrest, and here's a booklet that you have to complete if you don't arrest. But there can be lots of reasons why the arrest doesn't happen. And of course, each time the police are called, it can be like kicking over a proverbial beehive, in that individual just gets angrier and angrier. Certainly someone like OJ would not like to be challenged, but, we understand his celebrity status, and some people wouldn't want to make that call, and that would actually act as a protective factor to him, that it's not being taken seriously and he's not being arrested for doing these things. For Nicole, all it says is, nothing's going to happen to that individual, and actually, no one's going to help you leave safely. But I think on the actual night of the murders, she had called her sister, and I think that there's some important things about what went on there, that because there's been so much back and forth, and incidentally it normally takes an abused victim 7 times on average to leave an abusive partner. So this is played out 7 times. 7 documented. Yeah, there's probably many other times. But sometimes the war of attrition is so great that it's easier to go back, rather than when someone becomes very unpredictable and they up the ante and they start their stalking behaviour. It can just wear the victim down. And I believe Nicole was worn down. She wanted to have a life that was free of abuse, and I do believe that she cared and loved OJ, but she just didn't want the abuse in her life, and it was that part that she was rejecting. But they had been divorced for 2 years prior to the murder, so when we think about trigger behaviours and what was going on, Well, certainly according to her sister Tanya, she had said that she had basically wanted to lead her life and live it the way that she wanted. And that she wanted to start, this was a quote from her sister. It was actually Denise that she was talking to, saying, "I can't wait to start my new life. Let's go camping. Let's go to Club Med. Let's take the kids on vacation." So she was ready to find new friends as she realised she didn't have any. So there's a finality here. And this for me is an important point, and it's not really documented in the literature or the research, but it's something when I train professionals, I make it very clear that with cases, we can see a finality point where one absolutely draws a line and is not going to move, and that's normally the abused victim, and they are not prepared to be talked round or talked down. Perpetrators know this too, when that finality moment can happen. And where you think it might be them losing control, paradoxically, it's them taking control. And when someone's lost everything, or they believe that they've lost everything, they're capable of anything. So we have to understand the psychology of what's going on, and I think that's quite an important context to what happened that night. And we'll get more into, we talked about the crime scene, but some of the theories around other individuals and other parts that people play in this too.
Well, I think another aspect that might have something to do with why does she stay? I've seen this before as well in cases in which when Nicole met OJ, she was actually 18 years old. She was a teenager, just a young woman, just became, an adult. And OJ was, I would say, 29 or more. What was his birthday? We could figure it out. But he was at least 29 years old at the time. And so he probably specifically targeted her because she was young and probably starstruck and
malleable.
And he could take advantage of her and sort of set up a set of circumstances where he could control her. I mean, and I think she probably over those 17 years or whatever that they were together, she probably made a number of attempts to break away from his control. He got loud and violent and angry and took it out on her physically as well as emotionally and psychologically. And she, because they had kids together, I mean, she probably wanted to maintain. She probably wanted to have a semblance of a family. She probably hoped that it would work out. She probably still loved him, even though he was doing these bad things because it's, quote, not like him. But the fact is that this could be a pattern of behavior that he actually planned from day one. He wants to get somebody he can control. He doesn't look for sort of an equal. He looks for somebody younger who look up to him, who isn't going to be sort of standing on her own 2 feet. But Nicole happened to be somebody who had a strong will, who was able eventually to do that. And when she got away from him, she rightly predicted that he was going to make her pay with her life and get away with it.
Well, if I can't have you, no one can. And, if you were to ever leave me, and these are the things that I hear quoted prior to homicidal events. So I've seen that in many domestic violence murders. And if I had a pound or a dollar for every time I heard it, I would be very rich by now. But it's important to understand those things that are said, the things that keep someone in situ and work as a tactic for a period of time. But then when the perpetrator knows that that currency on the power and control wheel isn't working anymore, that's when they may do the thing that has a catastrophic consequence, which is this. And certainly when he met Nicole, he was already married to Marguerite. So
That's right.
He cheated on his first wife, I believe, to be with Nicole. And maybe she had that adulation and was, full of, adoring him and loving him. But things change over time. And she certainly said to her sister Tanya in 1992 that, she was working at this marriage, and she'd been working at it so hard, but she was the person dancing alone, i.e.,
doing all the work,
that she had finally drawn the line and had enough. And that's where the divorce had come in. But of course, others report that there was a lot of back and forth. They were the most divorced couple, in inverted commas. But that's people's perception. There's nothing to say that Nicole wanted that to happen. It's something that happened because OJ would not let the relationship or her go.
And he probably used the children to maintain that relationship. I mean, these kids were very young at the time she was killed. I mean, he probably deliberately got her pregnant because he thought that was a way to keep her under control. It's, like you said, the perception from the outside could be extremely different from the inside.
Exactly. And I think what her family have gone on to do is, fantastic in terms of her legacy. But I think the thing that, certainly when I speak to families who have lost their loved ones through domestic violence, many of them say, well, if only we had known, if only X, Y or Z had been said. And I also listen to a lot of families who were told about what was going on, but they just didn't understand the risk factors or the warning signs. And this is why it's so important that people do understand that our analysis and our research has moved on now, and we have got some good risk tools that are available. And, I take your point, Jim, not everybody has the luxury of being in the training room, but everybody has the luxury of Googling, and are able to go on the internet and do some research. Yeah. And, police forces, they are there to protect.
Well, I hope they're listening and they do that.
So there is a lot of training that myself and other experts do in this field in particular, and we play a lot of 911 and 999 calls. In fact, I use some material from San Diego of a number of 911 calls when I'm running training sessions, because the 911s are the same as the 999s. In some cases you can hear the victim's fear, and other cases you don't. And why you don't hear sometimes the fear is because we all react differently when we're in crisis and trauma and when we're fearful. So there's also some nuanced things, but certainly there's some risk factors. And like I said, we know that there are 15 high risk factors for serious harm and homicide. And even if somebody just gets, a few minutes to ask the right questions, these are the things that should be asked. And certainly in the UK and in London specifically, asking these questions at the front line meant that 58% of domestic murders year on year were reduced. And that's about 33 people less dead. Which is an important...
Each year, right?
Each year, 33 people less dead. And that equates, one murder costs about £1.54 million to investigate, and it's about $2.6 million. And so if you times that by 33, it's a huge amount of lives saved, but it's also a huge cost reduction in terms of the budget, which is another important thing, to be on the front foot asking the right questions of intervention and prevention, because domestic abuse is like a domino effect, that if you've got one disclosure, you're going to have others as soon as you ask the right questions. So taking one of those dominoes out by asking the right questions and then putting the right safety plan in place. There's the immediate danger that somebody might be in, but then there's the longer term harm prevention and reduction that you can do working in partnership with other agencies and people, with the victim's voice at the centre of it, to try and keep them and their children safe. And this is part of the legacy of of Nicole's family.
So what should people do if they feel a loved one is being abused, but their loved one is not coming forward, not reporting it?
I mean, certainly keeping the lines of communication open, so not making any judgment about what's happening for someone, because that's one of the reasons why, when a victim does try and disclose, sometimes people shut them down by minimising or saying the wrong thing. So not judging, but maybe pointing them to the resources that are available. So there are domestic violence hotlines in the US, as well as helplines as well in the UK. And certainly, going online, I have lots of people who say that they Google, risk assessment, and they can find the dash. And then I've had brothers email me to say that they sat down with their sister, and went through the dash risk checklist, because sometimes victims don't self-identify or do not want to talk about what's happening to them, but they will look for research and those who can help. So, not everybody wants to reach out in the same way, and we certainly don't want people to get to a stage where they're calling 911 or 999. So the dash risk checklist is fully adapted so that victims can use it themselves and see where they get to in terms of, how many positive responses they get, and then it gives a very clear indicator of what they should do next.
Right, but until the victim wants help, essentially...
Well, the first thing is just making domestic abuse a conversation that we can all have, at the dinner table, because until we do that, we remove the shame and the stigma, people won't reach out.
Right. I mean, the point is, it doesn't help people to put a cow of shame and embarrassment over this. I mean, there's nothing to be ashamed of. If you're the victim of a crime, you're the victim of a crime, and we should not, as a society, look down on people who are being victimized that way. It's outrageous. It's totally counterproductive, and it allows bad people to get away with what they're doing.
And victim blaming has to stop.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I was going to say that if anything good has come of this tragedy, it's that she really did elevate the conversation about domestic violence. Unfortunately, too late to help her, but she provided a face and a consequence to
it enabled
domestic
people to
violence.
have the conversation,
Right.
and I think her family showed a huge amount of humility. They put the children first, and that was always something that I saw throughout their reactions of trying to give the children, losing a mother and a father for a time, trying to give them a normal upbringing, but also setting up the foundation and travelling across America. Denise and Tanya have been very outspoken, tremendous advocates to ensure that people do not suffer in silence. So the foundation is there. It's raising awareness is such an important part, and that's why I feel strongly that the show itself does a total disservice to Nicole and to her family. And we need to have that conversation and ensure that the pattern of behaviour, what went on prior to these murders, is relevant, because it provides a context in which this murder, particularly Nicole's, and of course Ron, who was secondary, that context is vital.
Right. And what Jim had said in a previous podcast is, the rage that was involved in these murders. I mean, that tracks with
Absolutely.
this. And so that's why it can't just be, there's so many different rumors and conspiracy theories. It was a drug deal, this and that. But that doesn't track with
What it was. And typically, and we may discuss this at another episode, but typically the first thing that we do when you do a criminal behavioral analysis is look at victimology. And so we study the victims to determine how and who did this to them, how they did it to them. So you look at any particular victim, an offender picks a particular victim at a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular manner, for a particular purpose. And all those choices reflect back on the offender and why they're doing it and what their skills and needs and desires are. And so if you look at Nicole Simpson and you look at who she was actually exposed to as a risk, you'll see there's a very small pool of people. She was a low-risk victim. She was just outside her own gated house or condo, and she wasn't running around on the streets late at night unprotected. She was at her own home, and Ron went to visit her. Whether that was something that had happened before or this was the first time, or whether he just happened on at the wrong time and was collateral damage, I don't know. But the fact is that these were low-risk victims. They were not people engaging right now at this time in high-risk behavior that should have elevated their risk of being killed.
Absolutely. So the suspect pool becomes much narrower. And I think Dr. Werner Spitz, who also testified, also said this was rage, this was anger, this is jealousy. This looks very much like a domestic violence murder. And that was very close to what my analysis was as well. Multiple stab wounds. He used the term overkill. It wasn't just functional of what was required. It was far more than that. It was a lot more expressive, and she actually bled out. And we did talk about the crime scene and being left in a public place. I think there's the context of what was going on prior is
Right.
absolutely important. And of course, we'll talk about the opening statements, but it was placing it in that context was something that Marcia felt was a very important thing to do.
And to me, how the jury cannot see this, it seems like it just glided right by them, or it was obscured.
Well, it was taken
by
away. It was hidden through the distraction and detraction of creating other things to occupy their thoughts and their minds.
Yeah, and one point that I wanted to discuss at some point, so I think this is a good point to do it, is jury nullification. Now, jury nullification is a concept that is not talked about much in the annals of criminal justice, but it is a real factor, and that is that juries, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, can decide not to convict. They can decide for emotional reasons, for any other theoretical reasons, for any reason at all. They can just stray from what their actual job is to, based on the evidence, decide whether or not there's proof that this person committed a crime. They can decide not to do that. And I believe that the O.J. Simpson case was probably the biggest example of this in the history of the United States. That because the jury, that at least a significant portion of the jury was determined right from the start to not convict him but help exonerate him, they made that decision. And I think this is incredibly demonstrated in the fact that it took 4 hours after a month's of trial testimony, after complicated, really significant trial testimony. They took 4 hours to come back with a final judgment of not guilty. And that they certainly, their juries, by the way, are not allowed to deliberate until they get that order from the judge. So after all the trial, after all the closing arguments are done, that is when the jury is supposed to first deliberate on the issues. And you can't reasonably do that in 4 hours when you have months of testimony that you've just listened to.
Right. Okay.
So that hopefully will help give you some insights into Nicole and her behavior and the terrible tragedy that occurred. Not by accident, but by the deliberate acts of at least one person that we know of, and that person was able to escape justice because of the smoke screens that were thrown up, effectively and deliberately by the defense. But at the same time, there may be
More to the story than
yeah, I think there may be somebody else who may have been involved, and we'll get to that in one of our next podcasts. So for now, we're signing off at Real Crime Profile. But Laura?
So, yeah, I'd like to plug, I've talked about the DASH and the risk checklist, which you can find on the internet, just looking at www.dashriskchecklist.co.uk. But I'd also like to say, seeing as Jim mentioned about training, training is a big issue, but I do run training sessions, as do many of my associates and other professionals that I work with in the UK and also the US. But I do have a number of classes running when I'm back in the UK. On May the 5th is a Dash Risk Masterclass training session, and May the 19th will be a Train the Trainer session. So we make it available to people so that they can come along, and we spend a full day going through. It's an accredited university course as well. So please do have a look at the website and drop me an email, or you can tweet if you want to, and you'll be able to find out how you register for those classes.
And I'll be doing some training at Dr. Lee's University of Connecticut on April 15th, and I believe the week of the 22nd I'll be in Portland to give some training there as well. So I'll tweet about it.
What's your training on, Jim?
Well, the one in Connecticut with Dr. Lee is going to be on profiling, and basically the basics of profiling, as well as how criminal behavioral analysis can help in major investigations. And the one in Portland, part of it's going to be based on my own story, my own history, and the other part is going to be on detection of deception.
Excellent. Sounds great.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Real Crime Profile.
For advice or support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0207 840 8960 or go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter, safety or counselling, call the Genesis 24-hour hotline 214-946-4357 or go on the website www.genesisshelter.org, or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 800 799 7233.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan, engineered by Jacob Moose Molin. Music is composed and performed by Simba Sumba. Logo art by Rob Cohen. Real Crime Profile is produced and recorded at Empire Studios LA by XG Productions.